Big rulings from the Supreme Court today, each with their own huge implications. We're talking homelessness, January 6 charges, and changes to federal authority. I'm Gadi Schwartz, and this is Stay Tuned Now. And a new decision from the Supreme Court now allows cities to enforce bans on homeless people for sleeping outside, whether it's on benches and tents or even in their cars. The High Court is saying that people can be fined for it, and those fines have cost some people almost $300. The 6-3 decision fell along ideological lines and reversed a lower court decision that said these bans went against the 8th Amendment, which a lot of people know is the one about cruel and unusual punishment. But the Supreme Court's conservative majority did not see it that way. Justice Neil Gorsuch writing that homelessness is a complex problem that requires a public policy solution. Justice Sonia Sotomayor disagreeing, saying, quote, sleep is a biological necessity, not a crime. For some people, sleeping outside is their only option. And here in California, shelters are overwhelmed with 1/3 of the U.S. homeless population living here. So the big question is, what happens next? And NBC News correspondent David Noriega joins us now in the studio. David, this is a huge, huge issue here in California. Does this mean that there are going to be immediate changes out on the street here in Los Angeles and San Francisco in like the coming days, the coming weeks, or is this going to take some time?
Maybe not immediate, but I think in pretty short order, we will see cities acting differently because of this ruling. It's also going to vary from city to city just based on the reactions we've gotten from mayors to these rulings, some of whom are celebrating it, others not so much. What the ruling does is it empowers cities basically to be more aggressive with law enforcement in physically preventing people from sleeping in public places and in punishing them for doing so without having to ask themselves the question, where are these people going to go? Without having to make some kind of effort to prove that the people they are physically removing from a public place don't have an alternative in terms of where they can spend the night.
And have we heard from local officials, and I mean, even the governor of the state of California here? I know this has been a hot button issue in California for quite some time.
Yeah, so it's interesting because what you have is a lot of Democratic elected officials in California openly and pretty enthusiastically celebrating an opinion, a partisan opinion, by the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Like you said, Governor Newsom weighed in. Newsom was actually involved from the beginning. He filed an amicus brief in the case in favor of undoing the lower court decisions, which is what the Supreme Court ultimately did. He issued a statement today saying that praising the decision for eliminating what he called the, quote, legal ambiguities that tied the hands of local officials for years. We also heard from San Francisco Mayor London Breed. This is obviously a huge issue in San Francisco, both in reality and in the press. She said that this will empower her and her city to be, quote, a lot more aggressive with people who are choosing to stay on the streets of San Francisco. Those are her words. It's not unanimous, though. Here in L.A., for example, Mayor Karen Bass criticized the decision and said that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem.
Now, this is coming from SCOTUS. So is there grounds for an appeal? Is there any sort of injunction that can happen? Or is this, I mean, the law of the land now?
Right. I mean, once it's the Supreme Court, then it's pretty much the law of the land. Although the people who brought this lawsuit initially did say that there were finer points in the law that the Supreme Court did not weigh in on, which they can now continue to litigate, including the size of the fines that the city of Grants Pass was levying against homeless people.
Okay. Fascinating. David Noriega, thank you. And that's not all the Supreme Court ruled on today. Justices voted on a case that could have some pretty big January 6th implications. This ruling coming down now in favor of a January 6th rioter who's been trying to get his obstruction charge thrown out. Now, this is not a full dismissal. The decision has been kicked back down to a lower court, but with a more narrow interpretation on what obstruction actually means. And now experts think that this might affect hundreds more prosecutions, including one of former President Donald Trump. And that's not all. Justices today overturning a 40-year precedent known as the Chevron decision, and that ruling could take a lot of power away from federal agencies. There's a lot to break down there, so let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Angela Sinandella. Angela, can you walk us through the obstruction charge case? Because it wasn't just on ideological lines like we've seen in the past, right? And could this affect a lot of cases, including former President Trump's?
Yes, Gadi, we expect this to have a huge effect on many cases. So several hundred of the 1,400 criminal defendants involved in January 6th were charged with this obstruction of an official proceeding. Now, the prosecutors there, who had never used this law before to prosecute people like this, charged them with physically walking in and thus physically obstructing the proceeding. But what the court here did is that they narrowed that definition and said that because this statute was really developed and passed after Enron, after officials were shredding documents, the point and intention of this statute was to criminalize document destruction or evidence tampering, but not really physically entering into an official proceeding and then obstructing it. So that really puts into jeopardy so many charges. It doesn't mean they all go away automatically. It means prosecutors have to go back and look at each one and see which ones involve evidence. Now, with regards to Donald Trump, though, it could have a big impact because 2 out of 4 of those charges that were brought by Jack Smith were obstruction of an official proceeding. There is the argument here that because there did involve an allegation of a false slate of electors, that it could still be considered evidence tampering or document destruction, etc. But that remains to be seen. Now, it was so unique, though, because we had Justice Jackson joining the conservative majority and also Amy Coney Barrett writing for the dissent and joined here by Kagan and Sotomayor, where she said, look, Congress passed this statute meant to be broad. Why can't we also enforce it broadly, Gadi?
It's fascinating. And then the Chevron case, too. Well, I mean, I hate to boil this down, but it was kind of like this 40-year-old practice of, like, when in doubt, I guess, defer to federal agencies when laws are kind of fuzzy, right? That's had all kinds of ripple effects for 40 years now. Do you think that we're going to see immediate changes here?
Gadi, huge. I think this is going to cause extreme chaos in the court. So when you think about any 3-letter agency that governs our lives, so it affects all of us, like ATF, SEC, DOL, FTC. I mean, I could go on naming these. They all really create these rules within the lines of what Congress passes. So Congress will create this passes legislation, and they'll leave it up to these agencies to implement it. But over the years, with this Chevron doctrine, they have been pretty loose. They have colored in those lines by making their own rules. But what the court is doing now is saying that they can't do that. All the power is now back to the courts, who are the only ones in our Constitution who is given the power to interpret statutes, interpret congressional intent, which means that all of those kind of gray rules that these agencies have passed over the years, including, for example, the recent one with the FTC banning non-competes unilaterally, all of these are going to be thrown into jeopardy, Gadi.
Who's underneath the piano? Who is that little person back there?
That would be one of my children, Gadi.
Can you tell them we said hello? Tell them we said hello, and we cannot wait to hear their analysis on SCOTUS decisions because they have the most brilliant mother. Yes, hello from Stay Tuned land over here. Oh, and she's gone.
Thanks for having us, Gadi. I guess you had us on today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Angela. We'll see you soon. It was a day of some serious damage control over in the Biden world after a debate performance so bad it set off a panic among dim circles. And today, even Biden himself admitting it was not his best performance. At a rally in North Carolina a little bit earlier, he was trying to make the case why voters should still give him a shot.
I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up. I give you my word as a Biden, I would not be running again if I didn't believe with all my heart and soul I can do this job. Because quite frankly, the stakes are too high.
Very fiery yet today. And NBC's Gabe Gutierrez has more on what the campaign is saying and what voters are saying after last night.
Well, Gadi, the Biden campaign was in full damage control mode today as President Biden headed here to North Carolina for that rally. Now, some of the voters we spoke with today after the rally told us that they wish they would have seen the President Biden they saw today, that they wish they would have seen him last night. They were frustrated with his performance last night, but they were still confident that he could turn it around. And he said overall, they felt that President Biden was the better choice against Donald Trump. Now, during the debate last night, a 90-minute debate, President Biden started with a raspy voice that his campaign later blamed on a cold. His answers seemed to meander, several of them, and he ended up getting more aggressive as the night wore on. So did former President Trump. Trump. And despite the fact that former President Trump repeated some of the lies that he often has said throughout his campaign regarding widespread fraud during the 2020 election, that false claim, and also saying that the majority of Americans support overturning Roe v. Wade when polls show otherwise. The Biden campaign says that former President Trump did what he did before, what he has done, and repeat these falsehoods. And they say that President Biden was able to call him out throughout the debate. But what many voters saw was President Biden, who, even though he had been preparing for several days at Camp David, did not get his message across. Take a listen to some of those voters we spoke with earlier today here in North Carolina.
Who else is there? That's the question. He's the one who's been out front. Can he do it? Yeah. Is he going to be running his ass into the ground, campaigning? Probably should pace it better.
It wasn't his best night, but he's a better president, he's a better man, and he's going to get my vote and my work for the next 5 months.
Now, Biden aides are not sugarcoating this. They acknowledge that he had a bad night, but they argue that one bad night should not define an entire campaign. Still, even though President Biden is heading to a fundraiser tonight, as well as one tomorrow, we're hearing from some Democratic donors who are nervous. And late today, a major editorial in the New York Times, the editorial board publishing a scathing piece calling for President Biden to leave this race, saying that he is not the man he was 4 years ago. Gadi.
Yeah, some busy days ahead for the president. Meanwhile, last night continues to drive a lot of chatter within the Democratic Party about whether the president is fit for a second term. NBC's Peter Alexander has more.
Tonight, as President Biden defends his place atop the ticket, some Democrats are considering an extraordinary scenario, whether someone else should be their nominee. Overnight, private worries turn into public alarm.
He had one thing he had to accomplish, and that was reassure America that he was up to the job at his age. And he failed at that tonight.
There are going to be discussions about whether he should continue.
The doubts deepening. One veteran Democratic strategist telling NBC News there is no coming back from this disaster. But tonight, this forceful show of support from former President Obama, writing, "Bad debate nights happen. Trust me, I know." But this election is still a choice between someone who has fought for ordinary folks his entire life and someone who only cares about himself. Adding, last night didn't change that. And this from California Governor Gavin Newsom, who some Democrats have floated as an alternative nominee.
You don't turn your back because of one performance. What kind of party does that?
Also defending the president, Democratic Senator John Fetterman, who won despite struggling in his own debate following a stroke, saying, "I refuse to join the Democratic vultures on Biden's shoulder." But more perilous for the president, his performance comes after the White House spent months pushing back against any questions about his mental and physical fitness to serve. The only plausible scenario for Democrats to select a new nominee, according to a DNC Rules Committee member, would be for the president himself to decide to withdraw.
He himself would have to get out of the race, okay? There's no other way to do it. Because those delegates that are already elected, they like Joe Biden, they're loyal to Joe Biden.
If President Biden were to drop out before he's formally nominated in August, it could create a free-for-all among Democrats because there's no mechanism for him or anyone else to anoint a chosen successor. Still, President Biden made clear again today that he's not going anywhere, and the president's aides tonight say that he'll do the second scheduled debate in September.
Interesting. Peter Alexander, thank you. And breaking news tonight as the New Mexico judge in the Rust shooting trial has officially denied yet another motion by Alec Baldwin's legal team. This denial paving the way for jury selection to start in less than 2 weeks for Baldwin's trial. Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Dana Griffin, who has more on this update. So, Dana, I mean, the trial is right around the corner. This seemed like a last-ditch effort. Is it? No more appeals here? Is it going to happen?
Well, technically, but there's an interesting part to this. Technically, if the defense and prosecution can come to some sort of last-minute plea deal agreement, there's still an option between now and July 9th that they could possibly work out a way for him to not go to trial. But this has been such a contentious process of them going back and forth, and just some of their filings have been really nasty toward each other, that I think that would be very unlikely. But again, never say never. But at this point, he's pretty much out of options when it comes to what else he can file to try to get the indictment thrown out. So this latest one had to deal with destruction of evidence. That revolver that fired that fatal round was inadvertently destroyed when the FBI tested it during their not drop analysis. It was a misfire analysis. They tried to see if they could get this gun to misfire by hitting it to try to prove or disprove Baldwin's claims that he never pulled the trigger. They were able to do that, but only by breaking it, because they had to hit it several times with the mallet. So the defense said, well, they destroyed evidence. This case should be thrown out. Well, the judge ruled that in this case, there was no bad faith. Yes, it's the state's job to preserve evidence, but if it's destroyed and there's no bad faith, no sort of sabotage, then it's the defense's burden to try to prove whether or not that this was, to try to stack the case against them, as they've mentioned before, and the judge just did not find that in this case. But something interesting that she wrote in her filing today, she says that they must disclose that the destruction of this firearm occurred. So they can't get in there and say, the weapon, give all this evidence and not say, oh, by the way,
it's broken and it was a mallet and it was our bad. Or
exactly.
So do you think that gun's going to play a pretty big role in this trial? I mean, even without this dismissal, it seems like this is something that they could point to and say, hey, look,
possibly.
broke the gun.
And the defense tried to point to that during their other motions. They said, hey, the gun just went off. And they said, hey, we've got several witnesses who will say the gun just went off. And if he can convince a jury that he didn't pull the trigger, the state says they're going to present several videos. How are they going to prove that he did not pull the trigger? That's going to be the big question here, because during Hannah Gutierrez Reed's trial, they did not have video of the actual shooting. So unless they pull something that they weren't able to present during Hannah's trial, then they may not be able to show, in fact, that he pulled or did not pull this trigger. And so the defense is probably going to try to use that and say, this gun is broken, so we can't go back and try to see if it ever worked and if maybe there was something faulty there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just when we thought we had seen it all on this case. Dana, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And don't go anywhere. We are just getting started. Coming up, we are keeping an eye on severe storms making their way through the Atlantic. NBC's Bill Cairns will have the forecast. Plus, they're now experimenting with performing kidney transplants while the patient is awake. This is actually happening, and Dr. Akshay Syal is going to break it all down for us. And NASA has selected Elon Musk's SpaceX to bring down the ISS. Yeah, the International Space Station actually has to be brought back to Earth. Some of it's going to burn up in the atmosphere, but parts are going to fall on Earth. So how is the world going to make that happen? We're going to tell you later this hour, but let's head to break with a look at when it launched back in 1999.
And liftoff. Liftoff of the Proton rocket and the Zarya control module. The International Space Station is underway.
Hey, welcome back, and here are some of the stories happening out west that we're following right now. In Idaho, the judge has set a trial date for Brian Kohberger. He's accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students nearly 2 years ago. Now, the case is scheduled to head to trial on June 2nd, 2025, but the location of the trial, that's still up in the air. The judge still hasn't ruled on changing the trial's venue because of its high profile. And California officials have evacuated the area near Fresno after lightning sparked wildfires there. And those fires have now started to spread beyond 10,000 acres, and they've put over 900 homes at risk. More than 1,500 firefighters are on scene right now trying to contain those fires. And get ready for some pandemonium. These little guys have safely arrived at San Diego Zoo Thursday, and they are the first pandas to come to the United States in nearly 21 years. The San Diego Zoo says the pandas will be closely monitored by wildlife health and care teams to decide when they are ready to meet their adoring public. And tonight, there are new charges against 2 former officers in Uvalde, Texas, including a police chief. Now, it's been more than 2 years since a gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School. And now the school district's police chief, Pete Arredondo, is accused of child endangerment and abandonment. Now, Arredondo was the on-scene commander and at the time was among the officers who faced criticism for how they handled the active shooter situation. They waited more than 70 minutes to confront the shooter who had barricaded himself inside of a classroom with dozens of students. Here's how one victim's family responded to that news.
They didn't pull the trigger, but they sat idly by and allowed it to happen and allowed our children to bleed out.
Let's bring in NBC News' correspondent Priscilla Thompson. Priscilla, can you tell us a little bit more about this indictment and what's next for Arredondo?
Yeah, so Pete Arredondo has been indicted on 10 counts of endangering and abandoning a child, and each of those counts corresponds with one of the children who survived this deadly massacre. And we have been going through this 30-page indictment, and it lays out nearly a dozen failures that this grand jury found Arredondo culpable of, including a failure to recognize that this was an active shooter situation, a failure to try to breach that door or find a key to unlock that door in a timely manner, and also for attempting to negotiate with the shooter during an active shooter situation. Now, Arredondo was arrested and charged. He has since been released. No word yet on when he might appear in court, and we have reached out to him for comment on this indictment, but have not heard back. But in the past, he has said that he did not believe that he was the incident commander of this scene. Gadi?
There were a lot of officers involved here, and yet there's one other officer that's also charged today. What do we know about him?
Yeah, there were a lot of officers, nearly 400 who responded to this scene. But the other officer who was charged in this incident is Adrian Gonzalez. And what is interesting here is that he has been charged with 29 counts of endangering and abandoning a child. And that is for the 10 children who survived, but also the 19 students who died. And I actually want to read a snippet from the indictment on what it had to say about those children who died and his response. It says, after hearing gunshots and after being advised of the general location of the shooter and having time to respond to the shooter, the said Adrian Gonzalez failed to engage, distract, or delay the shooter and failed to otherwise act in a way to impede the shooter until after the shooter entered rooms 111 and 112. So this seems to suggest that Gonzalez was on the scene before the shooter entered those classrooms, and this indictment finding that he should have done more to try to stop him. Gadi?
Wow, it seems like a pretty big development there. Any possibility that other officers could also be charged?
Yeah, so that seems unlikely at this point. This district attorney's investigation has been going on since January, and it was all encompassing. So it was looking at those nearly 400 officers who were on the scene, and these are the 2 indictments that we have seen come down. But thinking about this longer term as it potentially heads to a trial and possible convictions, I think it's interesting to look at what happened in the case of the school resource officer in the Parkland school shooting. Just last year, he was acquitted on similar charges. And so I talked to those families today, and they are nervous that that could happen here, but obviously hopeful that that will not be the outcome, because they do want to see these 2 officers see jail time. In fact, one parent I said that they spoke to said that these officers should be in jail for 1 year for every minute that they waited before entering that classroom. And of course, we know that was about 77 minutes in all. Gadi?
Priscilla Thompson, thank you. And Presidents Biden and former President Trump grappled on the topic of abortion last night, but it's been 2 years since Roe v. Wade was overturned, and court cases are still pending at both the state level as well as the national level. NBC News correspondent Yamiche Alcindor has some more.
Iowa's Supreme Court today announcing a 6-week ban will go into effect. But as lawmakers across the country grapple with shifting laws, families and doctors are caught in the middle.
I was completely confused.
Like Nicole Miller in Idaho. The 39-year-old mother of 2 little girls was overjoyed when she found out she was expecting a son. But 17 weeks into the pregnancy, she started bleeding.
My husband rushed me to the ER.
She says she couldn't believe what the doctor told her.
He wasn't willing to risk his 20-year career. And I was shocked. I was in a hospital with doctors who could help me, and nobody wanted to help me.
Because they were in Idaho, which bans nearly all abortions, Nicole was flown to Utah. She is now part of a lawsuit by the Center for Reproductive Rights.
I just kept thinking that I may never see my girls again.
What is it like to be bleeding, to be worried about your life, and then to be put on an airplane?
It felt horrible.
Many say navigating the shifting legal landscape is a challenge.
It's an impossible situation. Every case is different, and we have this law that threatens us with jail time. And so I think most people just aren't doing it. They're sending them out of state.
But earlier this year, Idaho Attorney General Raul Labrador said that's not happening.
It's really hard for me to conceive of a single instance where a woman has to be airlifted out of Idaho to perform an abortion. In fact,
what do you think about that?
I heard about that. Anger. Having an abortion that day saved my life.
And tonight, the AG tells NBC News he can't understand why a doctor would deny a woman life-saving treatment, adding the state has made it clear doctors are protected.
Yamish, thank you. And huge news out of Northwestern Medicine as transplant surgeons just did a kidney transplant on someone who was awake. You can see the video here of 28-year-old John Nicholas watching in real time as surgeons removed his kidney and then put in a new one. John says he didn't feel anything during the surgery and was even able to talk to the doctors during the procedure. And get this, he was able to then go home the next day. Let's bring in NBC News medical fellow Dr. Akshay Syal. Dr. Syal, this one is wild. I mean, I've heard of local anesthesia, but like, what's going on here?
Right, it's incredible, and as you said, it's one of the first times this has ever been done in the country, and the way they're able to pull this off, Gadi, so normally a kidney transplant, for those who don't know, you do go under general anesthesia. It is a pretty big surgery. You are put under for it. But doctors have been looking for a way, specifically at Northwestern, to sort of push the envelope and try something, a little bit more advanced and advance the field of transplantation. And what they wanted to do is, could we numb the spine? Could we numb the nerves in the spine and see if we can do it essentially with the patient wide awake? And you can see here they were very successful in doing so. The patient, John, is literally looking at his kidney right as it's about to go in his body. But the way that this works, Gadi, is a lot of those nerves that you feel sensation in your body are actually travel up to your spine. So if you can numb the spine, you can actually numb those areas, and you don't really feel any pain, or you should, maybe feel a little bit of pressure. You can see here a picture of what that looks like. It's actually commonly done in C-sections, Gadi. So it's sort of the same thinking here, and you can see it was very, very successful in this case. The patient did recover fully, and he went home the next day.
So the other question is, why? Like, what are the advantages to being awake? I mean, were they asking, I don't know, some questions about the procedure while it was happening to elicit some information that they've never been able to get because, kidney patients are usually completely out? Did it serve any, amazing scientific purpose, or was this just like a, hey, look at this, he can talk to us?
Right. So besides getting some awesome B-roll, the purpose of this, there's two medical purposes, I think. And the first one is you want to get patients out of the hospital sooner. And if you don't have the general anesthesia, you can actually get them out of the hospital sooner. Right. John, you can see here, left the next day. Usually patients who get kidney transplants, Gadi, leave between 2 to 7 days afterwards. And any time or less time you spend in the hospital, it's less time you have a risk of infection. So that's a big reason. And Gadi, the other one, not everybody can tolerate general anesthesia. People who have weak heart, weak lungs, who may not be eligible for a transplant, could one day, get this down the line should this prove out in further study. I should add Northwestern is actually starting an entire program called the Awake program, aptly named, of course, to get patients kidney transplants wide awake who maybe couldn't tolerate general anesthesia. I would just add, I don't know if, go ahead.
Yeah, you want to know what most people probably can't tolerate? Seeing the kidney over there and being completely awake. I mean, you've spent a lot of time in operating rooms. Like, how special is John to be down for this? Look, if they don't give me anesthesia, I will pass out on my own. How often do you come across a patient that's like, yeah, no, I've got a great threshold and I'm not scared of anything. Let's do it.
Yeah, you beat me to it. I don't think this is going to be for everyone. I don't think everyone's going to want to see new organs going into their body in real time. I think some people are going to say, you know what, just put me under. I don't want to know what you're doing. Just fix me up and send me home. So yeah, I don't think this is for everyone. But to your point, John is very, very brave for trying this. This is a relatively rare procedure. Fortunately, it did go very well. He is at home. I actually just heard from Northwestern hours ago. He's going to see an off-Broadway play this week. He's recovering just like you'd expect, and all is well.
Off-Broadway play. Gosh, I'm still staggered. That shot of him looking over at the doctor holding the kidney that's about to go in, that wild stuff. Dr. Akshay, you always have the most amazing medical segments. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.
And coming up, a monument and a memorial decades in the making. We're going to take you inside the opening ceremony at the Stonewall National Monument Visitor Center 55 years after the uprising there. But first, you gotta see this. This little guy, he was spotted at a Washington rest stop and might have come a long way. That little mousy-like mammal is a kinkajou. It's usually found in the rainforests from southern Mexico to Brazil, but sometimes they're owned as pets, and state officers brought him to a zoo. That kinkajou was examined. He's going to remain quarantined until a new home is found, and as adorable and harmless as he seems, according to the vet, he had a little bit of an attitude that would, quote, make a terrible pet, so don't think about adopting him. We'll be right back. Hey, welcome back. And here are some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. The Supreme Court rejected former Trump advisor Steve Bannon's last-minute attempt to delay his prison sentence. The emergency appeal came after a judge ordered him to prison for a 4-month sentence for defying a subpoena from the House committee investigating the January 6th attack. Now he's got to report to prison by Monday. And public schools in Oklahoma must have a copy of the Bible in every classroom and incorporate it into lessons for kids in grade 5 through 12. The state superintendent announced it yesterday, and it's effective immediately. It's the latest effort by conservatives to incorporate religion into classrooms. And just last week, Louisiana ordered all public school classrooms to display the 10 Commandments. And today, cleanup has continued for a huge train derailment that happened yesterday near Chicago. A car carrying liquid gas has leaked during that derailment, but it's been contained and there is no danger to the public. About 25 cars fell off the tracks, and thankfully no one was hurt, and that cause is still under investigation. And last night, history was made as Bronny James was drafted to the NBA by the Los Angeles Lakers. He's now going to share the court with his dad, LeBron James, making them the first father-son duo to play in the NBA at the same time and on the same team. Good luck, everyone that is not Los Angeles. And take out those telescopes. This weekend, an asteroid's going to whiz by Earth tomorrow. No need to worry. Scientists say it's not going to hit us. And if you're trying to catch it here in the United States, you should wait until after the sun goes down. You're probably not going to be able to see it with the naked eye. But if you have a small telescope, you might be able to catch it. But it is moving pretty quick. And it is going to be a very busy weekend as millions gear up or even head out for the 4th of July holiday. And depending on where you go, severe storms could rain out your fireworks. This comes after an already chaotic week of severe weather. More storms are expected tonight in the Midwest, parts of which are still reeling from all that historic flooding we've been seeing. Remember the Rapidan Dam in Minnesota we've been telling you about all week? Well, it is still barely holding on, but just take a look at the force of those floodwaters and what they've done to the land there in just the last few days. And on top of all of that, there is this new tropical depression swirling in the Atlantic. NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns joins us now with that forecast. Hey there, Bill.
Well, Gadi, things are heating up in the tropics, and it looks like we're in for a very active couple of weeks ahead. We possibly will have a hurricane on our hands by the time we get to Monday of next week. So let's get into the details. First, here's our tropical basin. This is Puerto Rico. You can see where Miami's located here in Cuba. This is the area of interest. The Hurricane Center is now designating this as a tracked system. So we started with being called a tropical depression. That means it has a rotation, it has a center of the storm, but the winds aren't strong enough yet to call it a tropical storm. Winds are about 35 miles per hour. It's moving to the due west at 17, so it's way out here in the Atlantic for about the next 2 to 3 days. It's not going to cause problems for anyone, but it will eventually have to head towards the Caribbean and the Windward Islands. This does not like to take a big hook out to sea. This looks to be a troublesome storm that is going to hit somewhere. We don't know where yet. So this is the forecast from the National Hurricane Center just out. And notice becomes a tropical storm on Saturday, continues west. Notice by Sunday afternoon, could be a Category 1 hurricane. hurricane, then a Category 2 hurricane. All of a sudden, we're starting to get a little more serious here with possible damage, and that's as it goes to the Windward Islands, somewhere near St. Lucia. And then in the middle of the Caribbean, south of Puerto Rico, looks to stay south of areas from Dominican Republic, too, possibly drifting up towards the coast of Haiti or to the south of that. That's still to be determined next week, but you notice Category 2, and then possibly weakening after that. It may have some land interaction. Conditions may not be as favorable as it approaches Jamaica. Our spaghetti lines, we'll talk a lot and show these a lot during the Hurricane Center. So this is where the storm is, and our different computer models, they tell us where the center is going to go. The storm just kind of give us a range of envelope of where it could go. Notice nothing is up here towards the Bahamas or Florida. It more or less tracks Jamaica, maybe western Cuba, or possibly there towards northern Mexico from Cancun down to Belize, and then into the southern Gulf. So we'll cover that about 7 days from now, but that's kind of the overall gist of it, the first kind of serious storm threat of our 2024 hurricane season. As far as the weather back home this weekend, severe storms are possible Saturday, Ohio into areas of western New York, including Pennsylvania. And then as we go through Sunday, a chance of strong storms, coastal areas of New England all the way down through the mid-Atlantic, and I-95 special, or not so special, especially if you're going to have airport traffic problems heading towards the holiday weekend. 54 million people at risk. So here's how the forecast is going to look as we head towards the weekend. The problem areas are going to mostly be where it's going to be rain and thunderstorms. So that's going to be on Saturday in the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, western New York, scattered storms in the south, where clear as could be for airports in the west. Then there's that airport problem on Sunday with big issues possible here in the northeast. And then let's fast forward just about a week from now. The 4th of July forecast looks very warm and humid up the East Coast. Storms possible Chicago to St. Louis, and a heat wave is likely, Gadi, for many areas of the West. We'll also talk more about that next week. It looks like it could even be a significant heat wave for the interior West.
Bill Cairns, thank you. And as we mentioned, it is going to be a very busy weekend for travel, even though July 4th is still a couple of days away. It's never too early to get your holiday break started a little bit early, right? Well, millions of people across the country, they seem to think so. And AAA is predicting nearly 71 million people will travel over the next week, either on the road or in the skies. And NBC News correspondent Priya Sridhar is at Atlanta's very busy Hartsfield-Jackson Airport with more on what to expect.
Hey, Gadi, yeah, we're at the world's busiest airport, and we're set to break records with 3 million people passing through TSA checkpoints today. AAA is projecting that 70 million Americans will travel 50 miles or more away from their home between today and Sunday, July 7th. So the next 9 days is really the holiday travel period that we're talking about. 60 million of those people will be traveling by car. About 5 million of those people will be traveling by plane. That's up 5% as far as the people who are road tripping this year on the July 4th holiday, and 7% from last year. The busiest days when it comes to travel are today, Saturday, Wednesday, July 3rd, and then you might expect Sunday, July 7th, the day that we're expecting everyone to be returning home. So if you are anticipating or expecting to travel through one of the 5 busiest airports this July 4th holiday travel weekend, which are Atlanta, Chicago O'Hare, Denver, LAX, and Dallas-Fort Worth, make sure that you leave an ample amount of time before you have to go to your airplane. Now, you might wonder, why is there so much travel actually happening right now? It seems like every holiday we talk about, we're just breaking records. And one of the reasons for that is that airfare is actually down 18% compared to last year, with the average round-trip ticket price for a domestic airplane ticket at $263. And then when you look at the average price of gas right now, it's actually at $3.50 per gallon nationally, which is up about a nickel from last week, but down about 6 cents from this time last year. So if you are planning on hitting the roads, they say the best time to drive would be Monday, Tuesday night, or on July 4th itself before 2 p.m. They say try to avoid driving between 2 and 7 p.m., especially on July 4th. Gadi?
Priya Sridhar, thank you. A historic day as we near the end of Pride Month across the U.S. It's been 55 years since the Stonewall Uprising in New York City, and a space to preserve that history is now open for all to see. Now, Stonewall is credited as a major turning point in the gay rights movement, and the goal of this national monument isn't just to tell the story, but it's also to honor the people behind the uprising. President Biden was on hand for the opening ceremony, along with First Lady Jill Biden and singer Elton John, and NBC's Stephen Romo is in New York City with more.
Yeah, Gadi, the president did speak here tonight on the heels of the debate from last night, which he did not mention. He did, though, introduce Sir Elton John, who also performed this evening at the opening of the Stonewall National Monument Visitor Center. Superstar Katy Perry was also here, and she spoke. And during Biden's remarks, he really focused on the history unfolding here and the importance of this visitor center, which is the first LGBTQ plus visitor center in the National Park Service. And now that, of course, was a pivotal moment 55 years ago, the uprising at Stonewall, when the building was raided by police. And instead of dispersing the patrons as they typically would just disperse, but this time they stood up, rose up, and protested. And now this National Monument Visitor Center is open more than 5 decades later. It is next door to, but separate from, the Stonewall Inn, still at that historic site. Here's more of what the president had to say.
To this day, Stonewall remains a symbol of the legacy of leadership of the LGBTQ plus community, especially trans women of color. Who for generations have been at the forefront of helping realize the promise of America.
Now, this visitor center ended up costing about $3.2 million. Most of that, by the way, came from private funding. And the center is open as of tonight. It is free for people to enter. The organizers do suggest you go on their website to actually reserve the time to do it. Gadi?
Stephen Romo, thank you. And still ahead this hour, exclusive reporting out of the Middle East. Food aid delivered to that floating pier near Gaza, distributed for the first time in weeks. Now, why the delay and why that project could be facing more trouble? We've got that coming up after the break. Hey, welcome back. Let's take a quick look around the world. A massive 7.2 magnitude earthquake shook the southern coast of Peru this morning. That massive quake triggered some tsunami concerns, but it looks like that risk, fortunately, is now over. There were a few aftershocks that hit that area, too, causing some landslides. Altogether, 8 people have been hurt, but no deaths have been reported. And the heavy rain in India got so bad that a roof of an airport in the country's capital collapsed today. The destruction killed 1 person and shut down the busy domestic terminal. Almost 6 inches of rain hit the airport early this morning, and that is more than the average amount the area has gotten for the entire month. The storms are still flooding the streets and causing traffic all across the city. And Iran is holding an election to replace its former leader who died in a helicopter crash last month. Voters cast their ballots today, and polls closed just a few hours ago as the hours were actually extended. And the ballots had 4 candidates loyal to the supreme leader, who is the final say on state affairs. In the past, there have been record low turnouts in elections, but the country's supreme leader has been calling for more people to come out and vote. And things are starting to heat up at Wimbledon today. The tennis tournament is back, hosting the 3rd Grand Slam of the year, and players started practicing while workers were there making some last-minute preps. The competition kicks off on Monday. And now to some developing news out of Gaza. We are learning that aid dropped there has finally started moving again, even after that American-built pier was taken out of service today. It is the 4th time the pier itself has been removed since it was completed in May, and millions of pounds of that aid has been delayed on the shore there for weeks as a UN food group suspended operations because of security concerns. NBC's Courtney Cuby is in Israel with the latest on the new movements tonight.
Today, the U.S. military announced that the temporary pier system in Gaza, known as the J-Lots, has been dismantled and moved back to Israel amidst high sea states. Now, it comes as U.S. officials are saying that for the first time in weeks, some of the aid that has been piling up along the beach there in Gaza has finally been distributed, taken from that beach that shore area to warehouses nearby. Now, U.S. officials are hopeful that some of the distribution will continue in the coming days. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 million pounds of aid has stacked up, sitting in the blazing heat for weeks as the U.S. military continues to deliver the aid, but the United Nations has halted distribution amidst concerns about security. And today, the U.S. is also concerned about a growing security situation along the border between Israel and Lebanon. The Pentagon concerned to the point where they rushed several military assets, including the USS Wasp, an amphibious assault ship, other ships associated with the Wasp, and more than 2,000 Marines to the area in the Eastern Med near the shore with Lebanon and Israel. Now, this additional presence not only serves as a deterrent to possible escalation in the tensions there, but if the fighting escalates to the point where U.S. citizens need help getting out of harm's way, they can operate to help with that situation as well. Back to you.
Courtney, thank you. And before we go, it is time for the future of everything. We all know a little bit about, I don't know, trading an old car for a new one. Well, how about swapping out an old space station? Just how much longer that version of the ISS will be floating around in space. And we've got new details about how they're going to get it out of orbit. That's all coming up ahead in the future of space. So stay tuned. I remember earlier this month when Boeing's Starliner launched 2 astronauts up into space. Well, originally, Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore were supposed to come back from the ISS on June 14th. 2 weeks past that date, their trip home has now been delayed for a 4th time. Now, NASA says the concern goes beyond the initial helium leaks. 5 of the 28 thrusters failed in orbit, though 4 did come back online, and engineers are now still trying to figure out what's going on to make sure re-entry is super safe. NASA is emphasizing that the crew is not in danger and they have plenty of supplies, and they could return in an emergency. And speaking of the International Space Station, NASA has also just awarded SpaceX, a Boeing big competitor, over $800 million in a contract to, get this, destroy the ISS. The International Space Station was designed and developed by a bunch of nations, and that complex, as we know it, that took place above Earth. It took its place above Earth in 1998, and it's lasted a lot longer than they first thought it would. But like everything else, all good things must come to an end. And for safety's sake, NASA says they're going to destroy it in 2031. And just wait till you hear about what that's going to look like. And who better to talk about the International Space Station than former astronaut and former ISS commander Leroy Chiao. Leroy, thank you so much for being with us. This destruction was supposed to happen this year, right? But then it got a nice little extension down the road. Why does the International Space Station need to be taken down?
Well, it was designed with a service life in mind, and it wasn't really that it was going to end this year because of the conflict, the political conflicts. There was talk about possibly ending it early. Russians, of course, saying that maybe they would pull out. But generally, everybody has agreed that 2030 is probably around the right time. That would be a 30-year service life, which is what all the components were designed to be able to withstand. So this is not a surprise. It's actually a pleasant piece of news that NASA is beginning to plan early on, figuring out how we're going to bring that big thing down, because the last thing we want, of course, is a big piece of it, or multiple big pieces of it, to survive re-entry and hit and damage and possibly hurt people.
And when we talk about deorbiting, I mean, deorbiting is it sounds like one of those astronaut terms like rapid disassembly, unscheduled disassembly. Does it just mean like using our atmosphere as a trash incinerator? How is this going to work?
Right. Basically, so SpaceX has been given a contract to start work on, basically a vehicle that's going to attach itself to the International Space Station. It'll have fuel tanks, it'll have rocket engines, guidance, and what it'll do a controlled burn to slow the station down so that it falls out of orbit in a planned trajectory. The whole mass of the station will get captured by the Earth's atmosphere, which will, of course, produce drag and bring it down further and begin to heat up, and most of the components will burn up, but several large pieces are expected to survive. That's why it needs to be planned. It's going to come down in a part of the ocean, which is kind of the spacecraft graveyard. It's well away from shipping lanes, any human activity, and the idea is that all these big pieces that survive will hit the ocean and not cause any damage or not hurt anyone.
Man, it's going to be quite the fireworks show. Do we know what the next era of international space cooperation is going to look like? I mean, we're ending this era of countries getting together to build something like this, and now you're seeing the space race take a whole different character. Do you think we're ever going to see a time where everybody gets together and builds something like the ISS?
ISS was pretty unique. I mean, it brought together former Cold War enemies, former World War II enemies, and it all went together a lot more smoothly than those of us in the business expected. It's done very, very well, not only technically, but also politically. And, kind of at least we have that one common goal together, right? But that's not all going to end. The exploration program that NASA is currently working on includes our European partners, our Canadian and Japanese partners. Russia notably has declined to work with us on that. But, other nations, as you pointed out, are also working hard. China is working to get their astronauts to the moon. Russia is working to collaborate, possibly with China, not real clear. Commercially, a lot of activities going on. SpaceX, certainly Starship in the news a lot. Elon Musk and SpaceX getting ready to launch the 5th test, hopefully next month. And so they're making great strides there. That vehicle is kind of a super shuttle, right? And so holds a lot of potential for future missions.
Yeah, and the talk of the cadence that may be going up to space is pretty wild. Obviously, we've got to talk about those 2 Starliner astronauts whose return flight home has been delayed big time. When do you think they're going to be done fixing everything they need to fix to bring them back home?
Yeah, it's a little bit perplexing because NASA kind of, said, hey, we understand the problems, the helium leaks, even the ones that developed on orbit, they're pretty small and we can tolerate leaks 100 times larger. Not a big deal. Okay, well, now 5 thrusters have failed on the way to the docking, to the approach and docking, but 4 have been re-enabled. And so, it's a little bit mysterious because before they said, okay, well, these guys are fine. They can come home at any time and they are in no danger. I want to emphasize that Butch and Sonny are in no danger. Space Station Services is designed to serve as a safe haven. There are plenty of supplies aboard for them to stay up there as long as needed. So it's really a matter of, okay, well, what new things has NASA learned about Starliner or what have they missed in the past that is now a concern that they're trying to figure out? And the thing is, the service module, the piece of the spacecraft that doesn't come back down, it burns up in the atmosphere. So, understandably, NASA and Boeing want to get as much data as they can before they undock and come home. But it's a little bit perplexing, I would say, because, hey, tell us what you're looking at. What is the concerns? What new has come up or what did you miss before? And I think NASA is doing itself a little bit of a disservice by not kind of coming clean on what's going on.
Yeah, we'd sure like a lot more information. I got to say, every time I start to get concerned or nervous, and I see the video of somebody coming into the ISS with their hair and, that smile on her face, I'm like, okay, everything's going to be okay. So, yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you so much for joining us, Commander. And that's going to do it for us this week. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you here on Monday. But until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.